Hello, I'm Kevin Roberts, and welcome to my show. By the way, I've been helping people succeed in school, life, and career for over 30 years. Today we're going to take up the topic of ADHD and whether or not it's a fake diagnosis. Is it a made-up condition? Is it an excuse for bad parenting or to allow kids to be put on medication so they'll sit down and shut up in school? Today we're going to get into the history of the condition and whether or not it's real. So ADHD goes back many centuries, at least in the written literature. Early mentions of similar symptoms like difficulty focusing or hyperactivity can be traced back to at least the 17th century. While the condition wasn't always called ADHD, early observations laid the groundwork for later research and understanding. And we're going to get into the details about whether or not it's a real diagnosis and whether or not the diagnosis actually has value for us as a way of understanding and maybe treating behavior. Now, the first mention that I can find, according to my research, and I had to do this as part of my graduate degree, is 1681 with a political philosopher named John Locke. He wrote an essay called Some Thoughts Concerning Education, and he suggested that, talked about students who could not keep their minds focused on tasks. One of the first mentions in literature that we see that. By the way, John Locke is the guy that came up with the idea of natural rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, which showed up in the United States Declaration of Independence as life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Pretty smart guy. In 1798, there was a Scottish physician named Alexander Crichton, and he described a condition characterized by the incapacity of attending with a necessary degree of constancy to any one object. Resonates pretty strongly with modern descriptions of inattention in ADHD. It's a problem of maintaining singular focus on boring stuff. However, keep in mind that hyperfocus also characterizes ADHD. About 50 years later, a German physician, Heinrich Hoffmann, came up with this idea called fidgety Phil. And these were stories that depicted behaviors in children that align with several aspects of ADHD. Yeah, got to add a little German in there. 50 years after that, roughly, there's a British guy named George Frederick Still, and in 1902, he described a group of children with attentional difficulties, aggressive and defiant behavior, and he labeled that as an abnormal defect of moral control. So, most often in history, when we see things written about behaviors close to ADHD, we see this notion that children lacked moral control, moral fortitude, and of course, corporal punishment, beating them, was the remedy for most of human history. We now know that many of the gene variants with ADHD have actually been around for tens of thousands of years. These behaviors are rooted in different variations of genes in the brain. We'll go into that extensively in another video. Related to this idea of children lacking moral control, I noticed when I started speaking at conferences in the United Kingdom that many boys only, were said to be suffering from naughty boy syndrome. In fact, Winston Churchill, great prime minister, was criticized for forgetfulness, unpunctuality, and being naughty in school. So Churchill, however, had periods of intense focus, hyperfocus, and he could exhibit remarkable concentration when he enjoyed a subject, even cutting back on sleep. For example, when he was in the zone, he would write 2,000 words a day for weeks at a time. And he discussed that when he would lose focus, he would go into his garden and lay bricks for a couple hours. Now, this is really interesting because it suggests that he was somewhat of a kinesthetic or bodily or physical learner and needed to use his body in physical activities. And that getting physical activities, especially intense activity like laying bricks in a garden, helped his brain pay attention. It's also called multisensory learning, which he did at his property called Chartwell. But Winston Churchill, like many neurodivergent people, suffered from depression. In his journal, he talks about the black dogs returning. And so this gets to the idea that many people who have symptoms of ADHD or are kind of on the neurodivergent spectrum, they will often have mood issues. And I can't go into a lot of issues and details of it right now, but let's just say that the same rough neuronal networks in the brain that are involved in mood issues are also involved to some extent in ADHD. Now, speaking of Churchill, we can use his life to talk about a great milestone in the history of ADHD, the introduction of the drug Benzedrine In fact, there is evidence that Churchill himself took Benzedrine and that he talked about in his journal that it helped him focus and regulate his moods. By the way, it's a stimulant, which is the same general class of medications that we use today, Ritalin, Adderall. The Food and Drug Administration in this country approved Benzedrine in 1936. A guy named Dr. Charles Bradley stumbled across unexpected side effects of the medication, observing in his young patients improvements in impulsivity and performance in school when he gave them that drug. Now, in that same decade, 1932, German doctors Franz Kramer and Hans Pollnow described a condition that they called hyperkinetic disease. Children with this disease couldn't sit still, had an overabundance of energy. By the 1940s and early 50s, doctors started coming up with broader diagnostic terminology. So late 40s, we get minimal brain dysfunction, and some also minimal brain damage. And again, they were trying to describe the same behaviors that John Locke had described in 1681. The condition was originally thought, at least in the 40s and 50s, as the result of brain damage, but current understanding strongly points to neurotransmitter imbalances and genetic factors. ADHD was not included in the American Psychiatric Association's Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders until its second edition in 1968. Called it hyperkinetic reaction of childhood. In the third edition in 1980, they renamed the condition attention deficit disorder and created two variations, ADD with hyperactivity and ADD without. Now, is it fake? Well, what happens is you get the New York Times, for example, puts out these clickbait stories that offer supposed evidence that ADHD is not a good paradigm to view a lot of these behaviors through. Be really careful when you click on these types of articles. For example, a very recent article claimed that 70% of ADHD symptoms cleared up when they eliminated food dyes and artificial coloring and artificial flavors. Be really careful with that, because I read that whole study, which was reported in The Lancet. But the problem with that is that when you have to do an elimination diet, parents have to engage in an incredible amount of parental control to get the kids to comply. That's probably what improved the ADHD symptoms, was the intense parental involvement. Dozens and dozens of other studies saw very little benefit, only for 7% of children with this elimination type of diet. Now, I'm going to give you an example. It's a small but compelling example of my firm conviction from years of research, from a master's degree, by the way, that makes a case for differences in the brain as largely underlying ADHD symptomology. There is, in the frontal part of the brain, there's a structure, one on each side, because that's the way the brain works, called the caudate nucleus. The caudate nucleus is known to be involved with our ability to control impulses, to regulate our emotions. Now, one of the ways we know this is when people have a traumatic brain injury and they have no history of impulsivity and they injure one or both of the caudate nuclei, they become impulsive. That's how we know. We also know that gene variants known to be associated with the caudate nucleus are extremely common in people with ADHD. Also, several studies that only examined boys with ADHD showed asymmetry between the right and left caudate nuclei. Anytime in the brain that we get asymmetry, one side is shaped differently than the other, that is a sign that something's not quite working well. That's just one small brain structure. There are numerous other gene variants that are also involved. What I want to tell you is that ADHD is one of the most widely studied mental health conditions in history. There are thousands and thousands of studies that confirm the genetic basis of ADHD, that confirm that ADHD is strongly associated with differences in the size, shape, volume, structure, and wave patterns of the brain. We know from twin studies that if you have twins that are born but they grow up separately, that their risk for having ADHD is genetic. It's their genetic inheritance, not the family that raises them, that accounts for the variation in whether or not ADHD shows up. Does the environment play a role? Sure. Can a good diet with good high quality proteins, low in simple carbohydrates and low in refined sugar, can that help people with ADHD? Sure, it can help anyone. Can omega-3 fatty acids help people with ADHD? Sure, and they help everyone, and they can be particularly helpful for some people with ADHD. But what I want to tell you is, don't look for a quick fix. Don't let your medical conspiratorial interest cloud your judgment. This is a real condition. This is a condition that we can see differences in the brain. We can examine genetic variation. So I'm going to tell you something. Be really, really careful. I've been working with ADHD people for 30 years, and I don't have any doubts about the science. I thank you for listening, and there are a few aspects of this that I will go into in later shows. I got so excited about this episode that I forgot to tell you to subscribe. So if you could go hit that subscribe button right now, I sure would appreciate it, because it would ensure that other people get this information. Thanks for watching. Please like and share, and I look forward to seeing you back real soon.